Want to know how to make your designs feel clearer, more readable, and just generally seem well thought out? I've got a few techniques I'm going to share with you now that have really helped me to elevate my UI design skills. I've often said that 90% of good design comes down to using the appropriate spacing. But how come something as simple as the negative space between elements have such a huge impact? Let me take you back to my first year of studying design at college. I used to think that getting as much information above the fold was the most important thing to do while designing, as people needed to see everything that was on offer, right? Over the years, I've come to learn that this only serves to overwhelm people, and that by spacing things out appropriately, we can actually improve the reading experience and guide people through the content in the most suitable way. The negative space between elements is where the magic really happens. And in this video, we're going to take 3 example UIs and make improvements using the core principles of spacing to create effective and more attractive layouts. So the first example we're going to look at is all about creating visual hierarchy. We're going to keep things simple to start with. We're just going to use purely text and with a CTA at the bottom there. And then we're going to manipulate spacing values to illustrate how making small tweaks can actually start to create some visual hierarchy without using any other elements on page. So if we take a look at this sample content here, it's well spaced out. The spacing between each piece of text is consistent. You can read it. It's of a font size that's clearly legible. The line height is of a good size. But there's definitely some things we can do here to start to build that hierarchy. And the first thing we can do is we can start to distinguish which elements are actually closely related compared to loosely related. So this is a concept here that if you're familiar with Gestalt principles, you'll know about this, but if not, I recommend going to look up those principles. One of them is actually the law of proximity. Now, what this deals with is basically the spacing between elements actually dictates how closely related things are. So if you think about things that are close together, you perceive them as being more related than things that are spaced further apart. So we can use this principle immediately to start to break this content up, to have it make more sense and create a clear level of hierarchy. So one thing we can do straight away is we can see here that we've got a spacing of 32 pixels between each block. Now we know that this heading is going to be the main heading, and we know that this block here is related to this heading, and we know that this CTA here is related to this bottom heading. So there's a clear distinction there between 3 blocks. So the easiest thing we can do here is we can increase the spacing between those blocks. So bumped up to 60, it kept the inner spacing to 32, and then instantly you can see there's a clearer separation of content there. Now this is a great start, but there's definitely more we can do here to bring this to life and to make it more visually appealing. Before we go any further, let's just clean up these heading styles to give it that visual hierarchy and structure that we need. So at the minute, everything is using a 16 pixels in terms of the font size. So what we can do here is that we know this is going to be the main heading. So let's bump that up to 28 with a line height of 36. We might even drop the letter spacing a little bit, which is always a useful thing to do when the heading gets larger. A slight drop in letter spacing gives it a tighter, more cohesive feel. Next up, we can do the section heading. Let's bump this up to 20 with a line height 28. That's good. And then we can do the same for this heading down here. Okay, so instantly we now have that visual hierarchy that we're going for. And the final technique we're going to apply to this example deals with another of Gestalt principles. This principle is the law of common region. So to illustrate this, we're going to take this bottom CTA block here. So we know this is separate to the content above because it deals with a different article entirely. So although we use spacing to distinguish this as a separate item from the content above, we can go a step further by encapsulating this in a container. So again, the beauty of auto layout, we can quickly add some padding around this and give it a fill. So already you can see there that this is now a visually distinctive element, similar to the block quote in many ways, by using that background and that contrast, that immediately indicates that that is a separate element. And in this case, will take you to a different article entirely. Going back to the law of common region, effectively it means putting content within a visual region indicates that that is related and separate to things outside of that region. We can go one step further by adding some additional visual characteristics. Okay, so a handful of techniques there that you can use to take a standard block of text and not only create visual hierarchy, but give it some extra flair and make it more engaging and attractive. In this second example, we're going to take a card component and look at some of the tweaks we can make using spacing and a few other different methods to improve the visual appeal and the focus on the content with this particular component. So the first thing we can do is we can take a look at this, and it's not a bad piece of design. It does the job. It gives you everything you need to know. It does feel a bit busy though, and typically the reason for that is an overuse of dividing lines. So we can see here, when you start to look, actually, there's a dividing line between every section on this card, and even those between list items that are actually related. So you can start to see how this can get quite busy and add unnecessary visual clutter that might detract people away from the actual content. In my experience, you can afford to get away with most dividing lines as long as you use ample spacing and that you can actually make sense of the content without them. So let's just start by hiding all these key lines. This bottom one, that's a border. Now we have a bare card. Now we can start to add some spacing rules in place that will give this more of a hierarchy and make it easier to digest. Now, this is a good point to talk about a technique that I often use. So first of all, we're going to bump up the space between the list items to 16. Now, using a 4-point grid is super helpful. But one thing is not exclusive to that, but is related somewhat, is that the internal spacing of a group, if I set that to 16, the external spacing around that, I would typically start by doubling that value. So in this case, if we move out to the group surrounding it, and we bump it up to 32, it's a good starting point there. And because you're doubling, it's using a consistent, well thought out spacing method. And if you use that consistently throughout this component, you can start to see that actually it makes a lot of sense. And you can always tweak that yourself. But if you're sticking to the 8-point grid, you can just add or remove 4 pixels either side and just play around with that. But that doubling technique is often a good place to start, and it's worked well for me in the past. So now we've added some additional spacing here. We can see that things are starting to take shape. We've got a clear group here. So we've got heading, main content, and the action there. We've got that consistency in place. So you can start to see that actually the dividing lines aren't super crucial. Another technique that I often use is in the absence of lines and borders. Let's take the action bar, for example, where you kind of want to draw some attention to. We can use a similar technique that, as we saw in the previous example, around the law of common region, and we can apply a background fill to this action bar. Quick color technique. If you're looking for a gray background that matches the content that's within, I tend to take the color that's most prominent. So in this case, we've got this blue CTA, and we take that as the original fill, and then we gradually move through color palette there, using that tint of blue, but moving towards the white, so you get that light gray, but it's got a tint of blue, so it's actually quite cohesive and it matches the UI. So a little top tip for you there when it comes to color. And hopefully you can see here that by using appropriate text styles, spacing, and some background color where necessary, you don't actually have to rely on dividing lines and borders to create groupings. And actually, it makes your UI feel fresher and open and more inviting, and crucially, giving more focus to the content. And for the third and final example, we have here a sample from the Square website. So I've just taken a sample here from their marketing site. So we have a page here that has 3 sections. Now we can start to look at these sections closer and start to understand the spacing values they've used and what kind of effect that has on us as the reader. So the first thing we'll do is we'll grab this text block here, So we can see that there's 24 pixels between each item of text within this block. And this is related to the image on the right. And the spacing between the text and the image is 80 pixels. Now, if we look at the overall spacing, so the spacing on the page between each section, we have 180 pixels. Now, because there's such a great difference there between the spacing between the sections and the spacing between the text blocks and the image, that instantly tells us how things are related. So this block of text is related to this image is related to this block of text, and so on. So that's all done through the power of using the appropriate spacing values needed to tell us that information. So even if we added an additional paragraph here, because again, it's constrained in this particular section, and it's still positioned closer to this image than it is to the image below, it's still going to be seen as related to this top section. So really powerful there by just using some intentional spacing values. And one last thing I'd like to pick up on this is something up to do with line height. So we've talked about using the 4 and the 8-point grid in previous examples, but just to show that doesn't always need to apply to spacing alone, we can use that with your text styles. Something that I often do is, let's say I've got 16 pixels size font. I tend to go 2 levels up to apply the line height. So it's not an exact science, but it's something that I stick to start with, and then if I need to make adjustments based on various different factors, then I will make those adjustments accordingly. But I always try to stick to the 4-point grid, and I typically try to go up 2 levels when it comes to line height. But you can see here that actually it does feel a little bit cramped. And the reason for that is that because we're working with such a short line length here, the text just almost feels shrunk. So you sometimes need some extra line height to give it some more breathing space. So if we go up the next level on the 4-point grid, so we'll go to 28 for the line height, keeping it 16 in terms of the font size, you can instantly see there the added breathing space in the line height just makes for a more pleasant reading experience compared to, let's say, this one here, which is still at 24. You can see that actually the shorter line length requires an additional bump in the line height there. So another top tip when it comes to your text styles and formatting. So the next time you feel your design is too busy or lacks clarity, give these techniques a try and see what improvements you can make. If you found this useful in any way, give the video a like and consider subscribing for more.